All right,
How,
what do you got for me?
how is runoff affecting the Santa Barbara ecosystem?
And you're talking about runoff from creeks into, or runoff from streets and houses and such into creeks, right?
Yep.
Well, an interesting one about that is people always like to focus on the bigger animals, but a large part of the ecosystem starts with the little things. So we're talking bacteria, we're getting into single cell organisms, maybe we're um, talking about uh, all like the really small creatures that you have to look through a microscope to see. And that's really kind of the base, and they're much more easily affected. So you can move your way all the way up to things like amphibians, salamanders, things like that. Um, and they, breathe through their skin, so anything gets absorbed to them pretty easily. They rely on water for their eggs and their larvae, and um, so tadpole stages, stuff like that. So it's a much bigger question than oh, it affects fish. Everyone always wants to say it affects fish. We really don't have that many fish in our in our creeks anymore. It'd be great if we did, but um, so I think that's the biggest thing, and the different ways that we as homeowners affect that is you have people will still change their oil in the street, or they'll have a car that's leaking oil and not fix it. Those are kind of the simple things that we can do. Uh, Water comes, we get rains, and that then runs off from our streets into the storm drains, which then goes into our waterways. Um, I think probably a bigger issue is the things that we spray on and around our yards, I would say is probably a bigger issue. And that could be things like fertilizer. And if you have too much fertilizer, then you can get what's called eutrophication, where the waterways can become extra green with algae, and then that can cause issues for the things that rely on oxygen, typically animals, but that can cause problems in our waterways.
Yeah.
And then you can take that even further, and a much bigger question is what is what is the lack of runoff cause? And when we get into things like damming up Cachuma Lake and the San Ynez River, we're getting a lack of runoff. And we should have a lot more water going out into the ocean. And what does that water carry with it? When it's really raining, what color is the water?
Brown and stuff.
Brown, right? And so that's those are the little particulates, the soil that's washing down, the little pieces that eventually become sand that wash out into the ocean. And because that's not happening at the level that it used to, because we've dammed up a lot of our rivers, now we don't have that sediment landing off in the near shore, which then in the calmer months gets lapped up and turns into beach. So without that happening, now we've lost beaches, and you have more beach erosion, you have cliff erosion. Um, yeah, it's a such a big question, and there's so many small parts of it. But I urge, if you're doing some research on this topic, I urge you to look at the organisms that are more affected, that are not fish, that are not salamanders and frogs. We're talking the much smaller things. So I would say try to look at that.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And then how would cleaning up the runoff coming from Santa Barbara help the environment? Like, would that do anything?
Well, I'm not an expert in, how much pollution is making its way into the waterway. A friend of mine, Jill, she does a lot of the Clean Creeks organization here in town. She probably would have those numbers. And honestly, uh, because it's a publicly funded organization, you could probably find that data somewhere online. I don't know where. And I'd be willing to bet that with all the creek sampling that's done, that and some of the newer laws that have been put in place, I'd be willing to bet that there's data to show that, that the pollution is actually on a decline as opposed to the opposite. But that's just my guess. So definitely, I would say look around, try to find that data. Um, but obviously, when you have pure water, that again, these microorganisms that rely on having clean water to survive, they'll probably wind up doing better. And when that happens, you've got this whole food web, right, that builds up from there. So it's probably a pretty significant change. I know there was at one point um, farmers were using a lot of chemicals that uh, they would build their way up in that food web, and so they would magnify. And so as you go from one level to the next, you've got the second level organism winds up eating a whole bunch of the primary producers or whatever. And so you get a large concentration of this chemical inside of that first level consumer. And then the second level consumer eats those and gets an even bigger concentration because now that chemical is concentrated, and then it just keeps on going. And so the upper organisms were the ones that were really suffering. And these would be things like birds. Um, so there's a lot of issues with different chemicals that had been used in the past. We're doing a pretty good job, I think, of eliminating those chemicals, but Roundup is one of those things that was touted as being clean. How many people round up their driveways and round up the weeds in their yard? If you go to Home Depot, it's a whole section, right? That's Roundup, and people
Yeah,
are
we
using it.
went to Home Depot and saw all the sections of all the chemicals. It was crazy. Just whole walls of,
Yeah, and it's easy, right? Rather than go and pull weeds in my yard, I'll just spray them with a chemical.
yeah.
So, and it's touted as being safe, or at least it was. Now I think there's enough information out there where people are realizing, yeah, okay, this is not safe for our environment. It's not safe for people, but
Yeah. All right, great. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Good luck on your project. What else are you trying to do here?
So we have to make a video about some sort of local environmental problem and then say